triangle's got some sharp points, but square understands more science.
Okay.
This is high quality humor.
Yeah, but circle's a well-rounded candidate.
Hey.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to Talking TWAMPs. My name is Blake Phillips, and today I will be your host for this episode. And today we will be discussing the government shutdown, which at the time of recording is basically everything that the news is talking about nowadays. But before we get into that, a couple of introductions. As I said, my name is Blake Phillips, and I am a government and German major here at the college. And we'll start their introductions with the man on my right.
Can we also do how, if at all, the shutdown is affecting you personally?
Oh, fair enough. I live in the D.C. area, and while neither of my parents is technically employed by the federal government, my dad works rather closely with HHS and several other agencies, and most of their meetings have been rather stalled by that. However, he is thankful for how light traffic is these days.
And I am Joe. I'm an IR and Russian Studies major. My parents are both federal government employees, but they're both essential personnel, and fortunately, they both happen to work in areas which are either fee-funded or have leftover funding. So they have not been they're not in the slave labor situation yet. I'll also add, since he's not here, that the person whose education is probably most affected by this is our friend Ryan, who recently reported that the grants he needs to do what he's doing over the summer, the people who approve those is shut down. So he's in serious trouble as a result of this.
I'm William Moore, newly back from France, government and economics major at the college. And for me, my father is a federal government employee and has been furloughed, so he's getting those nice pay slips that say $0.00 on...
I've always thought it was ironic that they kept open the office that printed the pay slips, but that they aren't printing anything on them.
It's like, why bother? Right?
Yeah.
It's like, oh, okay, whatever. But it's safe to say that the shutdown is pretty directly affecting me, since I've been given a request to hold all discretionary funding for the time being. So that's fun.
My name is Jakob, and while my one employed parent is not directly employed by the federal government, my mom does work in healthcare. Specifically, she's an OB-GYN, and it turns out that a lot of the infant food stamps for infant children, basically, program, a lot of that is federal block funding, and so if there is no spending bill by, I think, 2 months from now, there are a lot of state programs, as it turns out, especially health programs, that are going to be shut down as well.
So it sounds like we've got a lot of personal beefs with the system as it stands, but perhaps one of you gentlemen can give our listeners, who may or may not have gotten all of the intricate details from the sort of superficial news coverage that we have nowadays. What is this? Why is it happening? And perhaps more deeply, what is it really? What isn't happening to fund the government?
So you all can correct me if I get any of these details wrong, but the way I understand it is that this December, when the Republicans still controlled both houses of Congress, a deal was struck between the Democrats and the Republicans to fund Congress without funding for Trump's border wall. That passed the Senate unanimously, as I understand, or by voice vote, one of those things, but failed to pass the House because of the conservative faction of the Republican Party. When it rolled around to the Democrats taking control of the House, Trump refused to take the old bill. He refused to take any bill which didn't have $5 billion to build the wall in particular. So the House repassed, now under Democrat control, repassed the bill that the Senate passed unanimously previously. But because Trump said he would now oppose that bill, Mitch McConnell, who's the Senate Majority Leader, refused to bring that bill back to the Senate. So of now we have no funding, and that's the reason for the shutdown, as I understand it.
And it's interesting, the bill, I believe, that was passed previously by the Senate, now has been passed by the House, but the Senate won't take it up, does include funding for border security, for hiring new Border Patrol members, for building fencing, stuff like that. It just doesn't have specifically the $5.7 billion, I believe, is the number that Trump keeps quoting.
It keeps
earmarked for the
changing,
wall.
but it's in that ballpark.
Yeah. First of all, I think that's ridiculous in the first place that the Democrats are giving him that much. But it just goes to show that really this is a question of optics. Trump needs a figure that says, we are building this wall. I don't know that he even particularly cares about the mechanics of any border crisis at this point.
Well, there was that pretty funny, I remember I was watching CNN, and it was on one of the CNN taglines. That's just very funny out of context, but it makes more sense when you fully understand the designs of the wall that they were describing. Was President Trump says this wall will have to be made out of steel, and most of it will be see-through. I'm like, isn't that just a fence? It's one of those things that's funny out of context, but when you start to look at the actual details and the designs that they were showing off, it makes a bit more sense.
Yeah. Well, it's kind of absurd, the level of at once the level of detail that the administration is focusing in on, that it has to be steel and it has to be this design that can't be cut through. There was the whole thing with NBC tested a fence and they could cut through it with a home power
I'm
saw.
sure it was DHS.
Yeah, DHS
Department of Homeland
checked it.
Security.
Right.
Yeah.
And they said that it only delayed, people who had stuff that you could buy at Home Depot for about 15 minutes. Which then President Trump then backed up saying, well, the point is only to delay so that officers can get on site to arrest them.
I think the fundamental thing about the wall is that it is not a border security device. It's a political device. If you look at where illegal immigration is coming from, we've said this on the show many times before, most of it is illegal overstays.
And an increasing number, too.
Yeah. And the consensus, which is why the wall wasn't a big deal before Trump, is that a wall is hugely inefficient and even in the best case scenario would cause more harm in terms of environmental contacts and reduced border contact than it would save in whatever excess patrols you would need. So this is fundamentally a political project for Trump, which I think is why he's been so unwilling to compromise or back down on it.
And I mean, that's a fair assessment. I mean, President Trump has invested a huge amount of his personal political capital into this wall idea. It was the staple point of his 2016 campaign. It is what many people, I imagine he believes, voted him for that reason. So this wall, it's almost as if he's painted himself into a corner. He really can't back down from it, not without, some very interesting maneuvering on his part. I think there's ways he could probably back down from it politically without completely destroying his political reputation, so to speak, with his main constituency. But we'll have to see what move he takes. He keeps saying, I will not accept anything, yada, 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 and he's willing to shut down the government for years, so it's
an interesting question of how long, first of all, can he politically keep the government shut down before he loses what little political capital he has left? Because I think it's pretty clear at this point that accepting some sudden change in the next couple of weeks, the wall isn't going to happen this way, at least. I wonder how much political capital he has left and who breaks first, President Trump or Senate and House Republicans. Because, of course, if they vote in sufficient numbers, they can pass a spending bill over his veto. The question is, do they have the political will to do that?
So, there is actually another route out of this that feels like it was eons ago that it was suggested, but was only, I think, a week ago that it was first really majorly floated. And that is President Trump's threat to use, I think it's FEMA, but emergency funding to build the wall. Essentially,
what did we say? This was literally a plot on House of Cards?
So I guess that is my question. What's the feasibility of that? What do we think the fallout would be if he were to just do that and then accept whatever budget the Democrats pass after he'd already taken that money from emergency funding to complete his wall?
Well, you'll note that he backed down on that pretty quickly, and I think the reason is that some people who have brain cells left, and I'm sorry to be dismissive, but all the good people have been fired at this point, have told him what a politically bad idea that was. because if you read the details of that plan, the only way to get that amount of money would be to take a vast amount of hurricane funding out of Texas, Florida, and California, but especially Texas and Florida. Probably not a great idea at this point to suck huge amounts of hurricane funding when you still got 2 hurricane seasons before the election. So it's possible he does it, but my implication is that was bluster intended to scare the House Democrats into folding.
What I heard as a secondary option was that they could use certain aspects of the war powers granted to the president to do emergency military construction. This was kind of big, I believe, under Roosevelt was the one who really started using it during the Second World War. But the idea is to give the president the authority to construct, military fortifications as is necessary in the event that the United States is facing armed invasion. Now,
I think that both of these plans, and this has nothing to do with the feasibility of the War Powers Act. I think we've proven throughout the U.S.'s history that presidents can do a lot that you wouldn't think they can with the War Powers Act. I think the problem, what it comes down to is, if he tries to take emergency funding, if he tries to use the War Powers Act, the second that order hits his desk, there is going to be a lawsuit. I can't imagine there is a single federal judge in this country who wouldn't order an injunction until a decision is reached, probably by the Supreme Court. So I don't see that being a short-term plan, at least.
Yeah, I think that's probably agreeable, is that somehow some federal court, probably within a day, same thing that happened with the travel ban, is going to order a stay on the order. And we'll have to see how that power balance plays out, especially with the Supreme Court. Because I imagine it would have to go there. This is it's such an important constitutional question, and it deals with the imperial presidency, which is something I think we've talked about before on this program. And I can't imagine that the Supreme Court, which of course is very conservative now, would not want to at least weigh in on that issue.
It doesn't look like there's an easy solution to the border wall question of this budgeting. Let's pivot a little bit now to just the shutdown itself. Obviously, the president is not the only key player in how the shutdown is progressing. We also have Mitch McConnell, the Senate Majority Leader, Nancy Pelosi, the House Speaker, and several other high-up Democrats and Republicans on both sides who are putting together, or in some cases may not be putting much effort into ending this shutdown. Ultimately, where do we think the American people are going to place the blame, either majoritarily or perhaps within each party? Where is each party putting the blame of the shutdown?
Well, kind of obviously both parties are blaming the other. If the Democrats had better marketability, I think they would have an easier time of shifting the blame onto President Trump. Because at the end of the day, the Democrats have passed a budget. It, quote-unquote, passed the Senate as well, meaning that there's some degree of support. So if they could market it better, they can say, we've given them something, they're just not doing anything.
And I think we've seen some evidence that is happening. There was an NPR study, not an NPR poll, they were kind of, I think, surveying a bunch of different polls that suggested that, obviously, as you said, most Democrats blame the Republicans, but that the number of Republicans who blame the Democrats has been falling. So
I was under the impression that NPR article was just about broad-scale approval ratings, that most of the drop in Republican approval had to do with Syria, not with the shutdown.
No, actually, it's interesting. There were two. I know what article you're talking about. There were two. Okay. The Syria one was interesting as well. But there was one concerning the shutdown, which showed that a lot of Republicans, and moderate Republicans, were at least starting to blame Trump, specifically, not Senate Republicans, but Trump as a separate issue for the shutdown, which I think the Republicans do have a viable strategy there as well, where they can say, Trump is being unreasonable, but so are the Democrats. We are the enlightened center. Vote for us in the next election.
McConnell's been doing that. He said, he indirectly shifted the blame onto the president by saying, I will not bring forth to the Senate anything that the president hasn't basically already pre-approved. That shifts the blame off of him, saying, okay, we're going to pass something and send it on to the president. This now means that if he finds it politically unfavorable, he can just say, well, it's on Trump. Once he gives me something, I'll work with it. But with also that being said, the way that I think is going to be interesting to play out is to see, in terms of which side blinks first, so to speak. is how long the Democrats are willing to hold out. Generally speaking, the people who I think are more immediately negatively affected by the shutdown are more traditionally Democratic voters. But the more long-term effects are going to be felt by, maybe more poor agrarian districts that are not getting the tax breaks that they need.
Well, what was the figure that the Fed quoted? I believe it was for every week of the shutdown, it shaves off 0.1% of GDP growth for the year, which doesn't sound like a lot, but we're entering, the 5th, 6th week of shutdown now? That's a third of our projected GDP growth.
Well, no. It's not a third of our projected GDP growth. It's 0.1 out of the percentages that we would grow. So I think the Fed was projecting a yearly growth this year of somewhere between 4.3 and 4.5%.
I thought it was closer to 2. That's my bad. But it's still a significant amount being shaved off. And what that means is probably, as we've seen with the tariffs, the impact is going to be felt by farmers, exporting people like Joe said, who rely even more so now on subsidies, agricultural subsidies to deal with the tariffs, and people who have to do international trade. I don't know. I know the customs office is fee-based, but there's a question on how long the kind of peripheral offices are going to be able to keep doing their work.
I think on the political front, the fundamental fact is that for well on 2 decades now, Democrats have been by far the party more interested in governance, as it were. You're right. If you look at the shutdown polls, they've been remarkably consistent in what all of you have said, that Trump loses big time on that. It's like high 50s blame him, Democrats high 30s blame them, and congressional Republicans get away with it again. But yeah, Trump's approval rating has been falling, but I think there is that fundamental interest. And in fact, just yesterday there was a new deal that the House Democrats put forward, and they were offering another $1 billion for border security. And so I think even if the Democrats are winning the political game, there is a solid possibility that they will be the ones to fold simply because, they're not willing to let the hostage die, so to speak, whereas the Republicans are more likely to do so.
So pivoting a little bit then from the political question of who bears the blame to a little bit more of the contemporaneous question of who is bearing the cost. Excuse me. We talked a little bit at the beginning of the episode about how it's affecting our families in certain ways. But, for instance, there are waves across the United States of TSA's workers calling in and saying that they are not coming to work, of offices shutting down, of threats of tax returns not being filed on time. All sorts of agencies are threatening that essentially if they don't receive funding, there's no way that they're going to be able to function. What are you all seeing as the sort of most public effect that this is having, and perhaps maybe the effect that is going to push the American people to push their representatives to do something about this?
Well, I think there are 3 main groups of employees who are directly affected by this, right? On the one hand, you have professional employees of the federal government, people with secondary and post-secondary education who are employed in the upper echelons of, say, the State Department or the Treasury, who have been furloughed, but who are insured back pay, and who probably have some savings and can weather this. There's a second group of people who are federal government employees, like the TSA, who are essential, who have to go to work, but they're not receiving pay. And I know the TSA especially has been dealing with what's being called sick outs, where massive numbers of TSA employees are calling in sick, not as a protest, or at least it's not intended as a protest, but because they have to go work second jobs. And then, of course, there's the third group of government contractors, which we tend to think of that as right, like aerospace contractors who draw up designs for planes. But really what we're talking about when we talk about government contractors are janitors, national park staff who do cleanup, all of these sorts of people who not only are not being paid, but are not going to be paid for the lost work. for budgetary reasons. And they are the people who are being most affected by this, I think, where they are not only not getting money, there's no promise of money, and no real way for them to find another job, because, of course, there are so many of them that have been essentially laid off.
And I think, kind of tacking on with Jacob's final point, is that this shutdown, I think many of us can be indicative, is going to be the setting of the stage for many more battles to come over the next 2 years between the House of Representatives and the President, and to a lesser extent the Senate. So this probably is showing a lot of those contractors that the federal government might not be the best person to try to work with services from if they cannot guaranteeingly be paid. This might mean that the U.S. federal government might have a lot higher expenses in hiring these contractors from now when they have to deal with the uncertainty of working for the federal government. Far from reducing federal government expenditures, this might make them higher when dealing with contractors.
I know there was an interview with NPR where a contractor who was who had a secondary education, was doing some like high-level professional work, but was still a contractor, is not being paid, said he left the private sector because the government position offered security. You know you're not going to be laid off suddenly because of an economic downturn. You know you're not going to be eliminated because of redundancy, but that security is no longer there. Like, how do you trust the federal government to pay you if they just don't? And I think Joe mentioned that there was an issue of governance with Republicans versus Democrats, and I think that this is the image that Democrats really need to seize upon and promote, which is essentially Democrats are the party of governance. They are the ones who want the government to work, and the Republicans don't, even if it's bad for their base. Now, whether or not that message gets out and is embraced or works is another thing.
Well, and that message, I think it needs to be propagated both by Democrats if they want to utilize it as a political mechanism, and they kind of need to not be shallow about it, so to speak. I'm trying not to take a partisan side here, but I really do think that the Democrats need to be better in terms of their marketing with that regard. However, going back more to Blake's question rather than the marketing of it, I'm also very concerned about the employees who actually are, we have the sick out, so to speak, with TSA. This is happening in other federal departments and what have you. But also many of these employees are full-on quitting. They're just leaving their job to seek another job. And it makes sense for them. They have to be paid in order to pay the bills. Many upper-level government employees do have some degree of savings, but many of the employees on the ground for the government just don't. They don't have any savings that they can back up on. And I'm really concerned about the drain of like almost human capital out of some of our agencies, specifically the TSA. Rehiring TSA agents and training completely new ones takes time. We're going to see if this goes on for much longer.
And it was already something that TSA and other law enforcement agencies have been having a hard time with, is finding talent. And there's a brain drain now. I know one thing that has been done in California to mitigate this is California is now offering furloughed workers unemployment as long as they stay in their federal positions, which I think gives a degree of security where, you're going to be carried through the government shutdown and you can return to your job at the end of it.
So let's get into that then. Now that we've talked a little bit about the impact that this is having on the people who are employed, what has been the response from the rest of the world that isn't the government? So other businesses, other state governments. I think Jacob's example is perhaps one of the most stark, the fact that California, despite protests from the president, is offering unemployment benefits to all furloughed federal workers living in the state. But California is by no means the only place that is offering its own response. What kind of a response are we seeing from either the private sector or from other state or local governments to this shutdown?
Well, at the very basic level, and we discussed it briefly, specifically dealing with agriculture as a private sector, they're going to start feeling the pain increasingly with the lack of government subsidies and the tariffs combined. that are just going to absolutely decimate certain parts of the U.S. agricultural sector if we do not get the federal government opened, especially before, quote-unquote, the summer. Because that's when, seed needs to be bought, et cetera, et cetera. The U.S. may, if this goes on for too much longer, the U.S. may lose a quite dominant position in the world agricultural trade. We've also seen in the more private sector examples of citizens, I guess, helping federal employees. There's the news reports of, businesses are willing to offer a free meal to anybody who comes up with their government ID and they're furloughed. That's nice and all. It doesn't really address the problem, though, which is the fact that they're furloughed. And I can appreciate that people are being nice, but what use is it, honestly, at the end of the day? I don't know. That's my kind of 2 cents on it.
I know there has been, if we kind of come back to agriculture for a second, certainly there's the monetary issue of the government no longer paying subsidies or potentially no longer paying subsidies, and the issue of tariff enforcement on industrial and agricultural goods. But there's also a much more basic issue, which is the U.S. government does a lot of forecasting, funds a lot of forecasting both for weather and for agricultural prices, which farmers rely on. And I thought this was a really interesting point I hadn't heard of before. Essentially, the U.S. Agricultural Board puts out a forecast of what they think crop prices are going to be for the year, and that's what farmers use to decide what they're going to plant. So the losses that we're going to see, both economically and in terms of human development, are going to be not just based on how much money the federal government is spending, but also on the services that the federal government provides that we don't have to think about in our day-to-day lives, but that probably do affect them in really deep ways. I don't know that this shutdown is really affecting our international posture, though, because, of course, one of the sectors of the government that is funded and will continue to be funded indefinitely is our military and intelligence community, which is either a very good thing or maybe indicative of a problem with the system, depending on what your stance is.
I will note that the one area that is getting hit hard is those internationally related agencies that are here in the States. I can only speak for the State Department. If you're at an embassy overseas, obviously you work even if you're furloughed. But the main state and state areas here are almost completely emptied out. So all the sorts of analysis, reporting, sort of day-to-day communication with foreign governments, all that stuff is being put on hold. So that could be a significant indirect effect, potentially. I don't know how that affects the IC or the military, but that's the case for the State Department. That's being said, the State Department has been in deep trouble for a long time under this administration with the whole brain drain thing and such.
So perhaps a bit of a loop back, but one of the agencies that is being affected by this shutdown that not a lot of people are talking about, but is at this moment working on furlough, necessary employment status, is DHS, the department responsible for protecting our southern border. All of those employees, those that are operating as border guards, are right now working without pay. And
they have a sick out too, I believe. And
they are, yes, experiencing their own waves of sick outs. Perhaps this is a bit of a flippant question that I'm asking, and it might be more of a broad discussion on whether or not this is really about border security. But do we see the fact that Trump is effectively not funding border security as a bit hypocritical in light of the fact that all he's asking for here is a wall?
Well, if you buy into the Trump is a secret genius conspiracy theory, this is brilliant, actually, because if you defund DHS, maybe then you actually get a crisis at the border.
I don't think Trump is that. I mean, and honestly, we had this discussion going into the Trump administration in our very first episode, where I did say at that time that I thought Trump might be able to do some really interesting things, even if they were bad, because of the way he's kind of used populism. I take that back now. I don't think Trump is I don't think he's playing 3D chess with us. I really think that this shutdown is, as the whole Trump presidency has been, about optics. Funding DHS day to day doesn't look good because that's just sending agents out on patrol. That's maintaining existing border fences. that's maintaining border checkpoints where we let people through. What looks good and what will get him on national television is first a shutdown over a border wall, and hopefully, and I think he believes that this is where this is going, getting $5.7 billion for a border wall that he can then stand in front of and cut a ribbon on.
And that's the thing, that this $5.7 billion is not nearly enough to build the whole wall as it is. It's for, 140 miles or some such thing? So I think you're absolutely right. This is all about optics for him.
So, Jacob, one of the lines that you had in that statement was, it's the thing that'll get him on national news. And I don't want to delve too far into this, but I do want to have a bit of a discussion on what it means for what his intentions could be behind the wall as well. It's not the only reason that the president right now is in national news. We have almost daily now updates on a potentially scandalous and ever-growing controversy with respect to the Mueller investigation and potentially new charges. Is there anything to the theory that maybe this, not in its entirety, but at least in the newer developments, for instance, the fact that he's making some sort of address this afternoon, is any of this the fact that it's being drawn out, the fact that he's making new steps like canceling the speaker's trip abroad, is any of that potentially related to a news media overwhelming, trying to cover up news coverage of this other growing crisis?
That's an interesting question because it suggests that Trump is thinking deeply and strategically about the shutdown and about what he tweets out. I don't think he's thinking about it like that, but I think somewhere in his daily routine, he is sitting down and saying, BuzzFeed, for instance, is saying these really bad things that don't reflect well on me. I need to go out and, in the moment, say something to distract from that. I don't think it's strategic. I think it's a reaction for him, He wants press and he wants publicity, but he has begun to recognize that not all press is good press, even if... we perceive him engineering this shutdown, refusing to meet with Pelosi, walking out of a meeting. We see that as bad, and that makes us not like him. But to a lot of Trump's base, walking out of a meeting with Pelosi when she doesn't promise the wall is a good thing. It's impressive, it's strong, and it's a hard stance. So I think we need to recognize that a lot of the engineered outrage from the media, even if it's justified, even if Trump is doing these ridiculous things, it's not hurting him in the way that we think it's hurting him, right? What hurts him are the things that he's trying to distract from. The investigations, human stories, human interest stories about the shutdown, and really academic studies, professional inquiries into the effectiveness of border security. I think that beyond any of the kind of outrage over the shutdown or him walking out of a meeting, the most damaging thing to him right now are people, professionals, coming out and saying, actually, a border wall doesn't work. It's not even the best solution, and here's why we know this.
It's an interesting point you made with respect to human interest stories and news coverage that isn't necessarily academic, but would be hurting him. I'm going to level with our listeners. I don't watch Fox and Friends, but recently, in the past couple of weeks, the genius, I say with the utmost sarcasm, that is Brian Kilmeade, has been basically bashing Trump for a whole series of things, including the Syria withdrawal, but also wall building. The idea that this shutdown is not worth the wall, which is particularly interesting because there's a leading theory that Trump regularly watches Fox and Friends and has praised them on a number of occasions, and that his tweets have often mirrored quotes made by that station in real time. So is there any possibility that that the news coverage, even on favorable stations like Fox News, has begun to sour to this idea of a shutdown over a border wall?
Conceivably, and if that's the case, I'd say that you're right that the only coverage that matters in terms of its decision-making are those favorable news coverages. I mean, there have been theories that that's why he renounced the deal that he made in December. Well, everybody agreed to this deal in December. The Senate passed it unanimously. And then people like Ann Coulter came on Fox News and said that it was selling out. And then after that, he reneged on the deal. So there have been theories that he does make decisions like that.
And I think that's probably I don't know that President Trump sits down, watches Fox and Friends, and does what they tell him, right? But I think he probably does take it and programs like it as a barometer of what the public opinion he cares about is, right? When NPR comes out with a poll that says that support is eroding in such and such demographic group and such group of voters, Trump doesn't read that, right? Maybe his strategists do, maybe someone in the White House does, but it's been proven time and again that they can't tell him what to do. I think he looks at Fox and Friends as a barometer. Is he still popular among this one segment that he's obsessed with capturing? And for good reason. It's how he won the election. But the extent to which that's going to be able to change his behavior on this issue, which he's made very public promises about, I'm skeptical about that.
I would just say I agree with you.
Yeah. All right. So I tell you what, it sounds like we've basically covered the bases on this, and what a fiasco it's become for so many people's personal lives, for the operation of our day-to-day necessary government, for even things as important as national security when it comes to the TSA and DHS, which I understand is redundant. But altogether, it's a sticky situation no matter what side you're on. If you're the president, you don't really want this shutdown unless, we're talking about political strategy. What he really wants is the wall. And if you're the Democrats, you really don't want this shutdown. What you really want is to continue governing. And even if you're the Senate Republicans, you're not super happy about this situation. You do have other agenda items to be getting to, even if it's not personally hurting your image. So this is the big, broad question that everyone has been asking themselves now for the past 3.5 weeks, and the question that I'd really like to wrap up with after I make a couple of statements, but everybody should think on it. How do we end this? How does this end? There are a couple of routes out, but none of them look particularly likely. How do we think we come out on this? But while you guys are thinking about it, just a quick reminder for our listeners. One, this is an editorial podcast. We don't represent the ideas or opinions or stances of the College of William & Mary in the slightest, and all opinions expressed on this show are simply the opinions of those expressing them. If you enjoyed this podcast or enjoy podcasting in general, please check out the other podcasts on the podcasting network at William & Mary by going to anywhere that you listen to podcasts and simply typing in podcasting at W&M. Now, let's start in that same circle that we introduced ourselves. Joe, how do we get out of this?
So, yeah, there are basically three options, and that is, one, House Democrats back down and give Trump what he wants. 2, Trump backs down, or 3, McConnell allows the Senate to vote on what the House voted on and they override the veto. A little while ago, I was actually thinking that the last would be the most likely, but with the developments that have happened since, especially with the Democrats folding on the extra $1 billion for border security, I think probably the most likely scenario is sort of a cross between the two of them, that there's some sort of face-saving agreement for both of them, because really for both House Democrats and for Trump, this is crucial politically, and they'd both be crucified by their base for backing down completely. So I think some sort of compromise is eventually going to have to come.
William?
I have to agree with Joe mostly on the three different options on how this finishes out. That just seems to be the way that it's going to shoot down. I think the two more likely ones is that the Senate Republicans feel the pressure, especially if this shutdown, God forbid, drags on into the summer. Senate Republicans, especially from Midwestern states, are really going to start feeling pressure from their base. And I think that might cause them to back down, regardless of whether or not McConnell wants it to happen. We've seen the more traditional Senate Republicans, be willing to flip. It might not be unreasonable to see some more non-traditional Senate Republicans start to flip. I don't know though. But what I think is the most likely is that the Democrats back down. I know that the Democrats have put a lot of faith into this, but at the end of the day, the Democrats have usually backed down on matters such as this. It's been pretty historic that the Democrats are willing to back down in what they describe as, the understanding that the country is better off with an open federal government. Personally, I hope they end the shutdown pretty soon, because it's really inconvenient for me personally. But we'll have to see how this works out.
All right, Jacob, take us home.
I'm going to say, and this is, I think, probably going to be a prediction out of left field, I think there is going to be a Republican revolt, and I think it is going to be led without Mitch McConnell. Mitch McConnell has proved that he will remain loyal to the president, regardless of the political cost it incurs on his party in the Senate. I think that William was spot on when he said that the longer this drags on, the more independent-thinking Senate Republicans are going to feel the pressure to flip on this. I think all it will take is the Democrats giving them a deal that looks good with everything short of the wall, and the House has already proved that they're able to pass that. I think the Senate is going to be able to do that.
God, I would pay so much money for a ticket to watch Mitch McConnell get rode out of Washington on a rail. But we'll see how
sad turtle he is.
Yes. We will see what happens. And listeners, in the meantime, stay safe and have a good night.